U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is wrapping up his East Asia tour to Japan, the DPRK, the ROK, and China. What are the deliverables of his three-day visit? With improving ties on the Korean Peninsula, Pompeo made his fourth visit to the DPRK. What terms have been negotiated for a second Trump-Kim summit? As tensions between China and the U.S. have been spilling over from trade to security, how will Pompeo's visit impact future dynamics? And against the backdrop of U.S. Vice President Mike Pence's wholesale anti-China speech, is a new Cold War looming? What's next for China-U.S. relations?
Gentlemen, do you think a new Cold War is looming larger?
Well, I certainly think that it's not healthy now. I mean, the trend and the current development of Sino-U.S. relation, particularly this 40 years after diplomatic ties established between the two countries, we've seen so much growth, so much prosperity, so much cooperation between the two countries, and now we see it's having a U-turn. I mean, that's really is alarming. So I hope that things will get back, but of course, maybe both countries need a lot of adjustment, but absolutely, I don't think it's healthy for both China, U.S., and for the rest of the world.
And do you think this is a political theater for Vice President Mike Pence to deliver such a most anti-China speech? I mean, since 1972 when Richard Nixon came over.
I mean, basically for your answer first, no, I don't see this as a Cold War. It's different. And I think that was reflected in the Vice President's speech. It was a very comprehensive list of criticisms that had been articulated earlier at various times, but in different contexts. What I thought was unique about the Vice President's speech was in the past, when there had been criticism of China, it had been about particular issues, maybe China's policies to Korea, or if it had been in the context of a larger critique of world affairs. So the administration would attack, for example, the tariff policies of various countries, including China. What was special about the speech was it was really focused on China, and it laid out a series of critiques. But I think I wouldn't read it the same way as, for example, what ex-Prime Minister Churchill did in 1946, but even comparable to Putin's declaration at the Munich Security Conference. I think it was more, this is what the problems we see, but we're going to work through and change them.
Do you think a new Iron Curtain is descending on North Asia or Northeast Asia because of
No, I think it was a different kind of speech.
I'm asking your colleague on that.
Well, I think now we are, China-U.S. are really, let me put it this way, China-U.S. are really at a very critical crossroad, may either sliding into the so-called new Cold War or sliding into a new path towards the positive style of bilateral relation. Pence's last speech really can really be translated into different versions, like a version of Churchill, or just a version of one of the normal politicians from the United States. And even in China, there are quite a deep division to understand the speech. If we look at the speech as a declaration of Cold War, then U.S. will have an action, and we will have a reaction, and the U.S. re-reaction, then we will go into the Cold War. If we deal with this negative signal smartly and responsibly, then we can avoid the negative direction towards the new positive direction.
Now, what do you think of the initial response from the Chinese government, particularly that from the Chinese Foreign Ministry towards the speech by Vice President?
Yeah,
Mike
no,
Pence?
I agree with what Mr. Yang just mentioned. I think it's right. If you really view this as a Cold War, then overreact to that, then maybe really both sides act back and forth, and then we can make it really a Cold War. But I think that the response from the government was quite good. I mean, they repeated some of the untrue fact of that, and I actually also said, please look beyond this. We really have to be, for the sake of China-U.S. relation, and for the, we have to really stick on the principles that we have adhered in the past, and we should really continue our normal relations. So I think that, we'll still have that kind of expectations of that.
There's no question about the uncertainty and frailty of the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world between the United States and China at this defining moment of what Mr. Yang Xiyu said, a critical crossroad. However, don't you think the two countries have been involved in the game of self-fulfilling prophecy? Now, we may take the United States as someone who wants to inaugurate or embark upon a new Cold War. If that should be the case, and then it's going to be escalation geopolitically, spilling from trade to geopolitical areas in South China Sea and across the Taiwan Strait. If we take the United States, Vice President's speech as yet another policy paper, then it could be a different situation. So what do you think of this alleged self-fulfilling prophecy?
I think I would agree that how China responds to the Vice President's statement will basically lead us down a particular path for a while. So if the Chinese government were to try and work on at least some of the issues through, I think that the administration, as we've seen in the past, in the case of NAFTA or in the case of North Korea, is good about being able to make exchanges, think about comprehensive packages and so on. If the government totally rejects this and lists its own demands, then it's going to be much harder to resolve. But I don't think we're on a path-dependent process yet. I still think it's very open, very fluid, what we might see in the next few years, as well as beyond.
This tour of Secretary of State Pompeo took him to 4 nations in Northeast Asia. Okay, Japan, South Korea, DPRK, and China. Now, this journey of rediscovery sort of happened in the wake of the policy speech by Vice President Mike Pence. What do you think of the Chinese curiosity on, for example, the way of thinking behind the delivery of the speech? Of course, the Chinese government would use this occasion, the meeting with the Foreign Secretary, to sound out bottom lines. Okay, what do you mean? Tell me, what do you mean? So, do you think that's likely to be the scenario?
No, I don't think there's some linkage, logical linkage or political linkage between Vice President Pence's presentation and the planned visit by the Secretary of State. Maybe it's happened to get together. For example, Pompeo's East Asia visit had been planned already far before the Pence presentation, and that visit was cancelled at the last minute by the president, and now it resumed. So happened to meet with Pence presentation. So I don't think that's why. I don't think that's some internal linkage. However, Pence presentation really reflects the political background of the United States. Say the political atmosphere on China has become more negative than before, far more negative than before, because of varied reasons. Some reason from the internal American politics, but some reason because of the interactions between U.S. and China. But for Pompeo's visit, especially to visit China, I would say this visit is helpful to correct the bilateral relation towards the right direction. So basically, it's positive.
We haven't been able to read the full context of what was going on between our State Counsel and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Secretary Pompeo yet. But so far as I'm concerned, the meeting was described as frosty, very bad, because Secretary Pompeo said we have a fundamental disputes with the Chinese side on so many issues, meaning no easy job for the Americans to make any concessions on the critical issues of a trade dispute, South China Sea, so on and so forth. So basically, the Chinese observers would say, hey, how can you expect President Xi Jinping to make any compromise with the Americans pointing their gun to our head?
Oh, well, I think actually the Secretary of State Pompeo's visit was quite positive, actually. First of all, the American initiated. Second, they are coming at a time just a few days after Vice President Pence's notorious speech. I mean, on that. But I think the gesture they are showing here is that they're still coming, and then talking to us, to the Chinese. I think that should be viewed as positive. Of course, I mean he has to. He cannot deviate too much from Trump's hard line, I suppose. But actually, the fact that U.S. and China has to work together on North Korea issues, it's really still that we still have something in cooperation, and that we're still actually talking and we're still in dialogue. That's fundamentally important. If you talk about the Cold War, then there's no contact, no dialogue, no anything. So I think that he's making this trip, and he's including China to brief China and to get the consensus on China and North Korea. Shows that how important Sino-U.S. relations are still important it is, and I have to really keep that and have more discussions and discussions.
The bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing, which was started actually in 1972, has been one of engagement, basically, until this moment when disengagement starts to show early signs. And therefore, do you think this alleged deep linking between the two economies will pave the way for ushering a new Cold War? Because what we see is unconditional demand from the American side for Chinese to follow their orders, not advice, but orders. Say you need to be a market economy, because fundamentally Washington disagrees with China on our industrial roadmap, say 2025, and our pursuit of 5G. And therefore the recent agreement between Canada, the United States and Mexico is viewed as a landmark agreement targeting China in the understatement, because China is not viewed by European Union, the United States and some of the major economies, even emerging markets, as a full-fledged market economic status. In that way, China is likely to be isolated. And the agreement that replaced the NAFTA is likely to be the beginning, as a prelude to a campaign to isolate China. Because Mr. Lighthizer is talking to the EU counterpart about the same spirit. Okay, do not cooperate with non-market economy, otherwise you'll be punished. So what do you think of the implications?
I agree with Harry that it's possible to see that will continue and maybe escalate disagreements in economics, but it need not necessarily spill over to Korea dialogue, Iran dialogue, countering further nuclear proliferation, WMD, non-security, human rights, humanitarian operations. And so my thinking is that it's possible, unlike in the case of Russia, where it's not become possible. I still think in the case of China, it's possible to imagine there are areas of strong conflict simultaneously with areas of cooperation. And so I wouldn't necessarily think it would spill over. Though I would agree with you that Secretary Pence made a deliberate effort, Vice President Pence made a deliberate effort to include all the issues of concern to the administration, just to make, I think that was the first clear listing of everything. But I think that the U.S., as in the past, would continue to agree in some of those, even as we can cooperate in others. I still think, for example, on Korea, as far as I can see, there's still good cooperation on that.
Of course, the DPRK denuclearization process is an important part of engaging China. However, everything seems to be done on American terms. I mean, this is an area where you have to succumb to the American conditions, right?
Yes, actually, China and the U.S. really shared the common goal of the denuclearization. And now, U.S. also is getting closer to China's position and say, okay, in peaceful manner. Originally, we have a consensus, say, denuclearization, but we have differences. They say all options on the table, and China say all options but military on the table. That is the difference on the approach. And now, fortunately, U.S. close to China to say, okay, let's go peaceful solution. So basically, we have a shared goal with the shared principle, say peaceful solution. But we remain have a deep difference on the approaches. Say, phased, synchronous manner, or one stop for all. China insists on phased and synchronous because the whole course of the denuclearization is a complex. We need to accomplish phase by phase, so we need a phased manner. Just because of the phased manner, we should be fair play. Say, you go one phase, so do I. So all the parties related should go synchronous. But for U.S. Position is, you do all first, and then I can do all. So it's unfair. It's undoable. So that differences really impede China-U.S. cooperation on North Korean nuclear issue. But through the increasing exchanges, I think the differences between the two is getting closer. So basically, this visit by Pompeo haven't solved the differences between China and the U.S., but it contributes to the further discussion and the further exploration for the cooperation. So basically, the peaceful solution to the nuclear issue has become an inevitable trend, and the uncertainty lies in the technical approach level, say how to deal with, how to push forward the process.
Richard, do you think President Moon Jae-in deserves credit for reviving this ongoing dialogue between the DPRK and Washington on the issue of denuclearization? And I'm not talking about whether he's going to be the laureate of Nobel Peace Prize. Hopefully he's setting his eyes on that. But do you think ROK did play a critical role?
Yes, I think that we've been seeing what you could have imagined tensions between Washington and Seoul over the DPRK question. I mean, President Moon comes from a party that, or comes from a political wing that in the past had been sometimes distant from Washington on security and other issues. But so far, we've seen a lot of continuity with the previous ROK governments and very close cooperation with South Korea and the United States on some critical issues. It's a very difficult process, but so far it seems, at least at that level, the solidarity has been very strong, and I think President Moon deserves credit for some of that.
The issue is solidarity. This trip by Secretary Pompeo aims to consolidate the cohesiveness, solidarity that may serve to cement the united front of the three allies, the United States, ROK, and Japan. What do you think of, say, the possibility of forging a security mechanism to address regional issues? Because so far, with the end of the six-party talks, we haven't been able to have a regular security mechanism. Without such a regular platform that may be used to address critical regional issues, we're going to see more uncertainty. Do you think so?
Absolutely. I think there is certainly going to be more uncertainty as we are facing a lot of front changes and also the paradigm shift probably. But one thing I still want to stress that the U.S. still working with China on this North Korea nuclear issue because precisely by the visit of Secretary of State Pompeo. So now, even though he visited Japan, Korea, and Seoul and Beijing, so it shows that still, if it's a four-party talk still going on, and so that I think if without China's support, I don't think the U.S. will go that far. So now it really shows that it's so important, this bilateral U.S.-China relations.
But I don't think China is being brushed aside with the prospect of bringing President Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un together for a second summit meeting with the brokerage of Secretary Pompeo. What do you think of the possibility that China might be left marginalized in this process of a one-on-one dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington?
I think that is very small. I agree with the other speakers that China without China's support, it would be difficult to envision a successful denuclearization, demilitarization, reunification, any scenario you want good for Korea. And I don't think that's the administration, the Trump administration intention. I think the fact that Secretary Pompeo is here today, remember this idea of doing a series of bilateral meetings was originally a Russia-Chinese proposal. There was the three-phase process, and the Russian, I think Russian and Chinese foreign ministers said that a good way to perhaps resolve the tensions we were seeing last year is for us to begin with a series of bilateral meetings between, for example, the President of North Korea and the President of South Korea, or the President of the United States, and make progress in that, make progress in demilitarization, end the testing of nuclear weapons and missiles, reduce the military activity in the South with the U.S. and ROK. And so basically we've been following the Russia-Chinese path, maybe not deliberately, but the next step, and I still think that's the intent, is to then at some point we'll go to a multilateral process. We haven't reached this level yet, but at some point there'll be some kind of transition to a peace agreement. And then the mechanism, you're correct, as you recall, the six-party talks, there was a working group on the transitioning to a larger regional security structure. I think Russia was the chair at that, but because we haven't reached that level yet, we never went there. But I would not exclude there would be some effort to resume that under the Trump administration moon. And I just can't, I would think China is inevitably going to be involved in that process and can play a very positive role.
And I'm really afraid that China will be hesitant to attend the next Shangri-La security dialogue, which could be part of the regional security mechanism. Now, having said this, Xu, I wonder if you agree with me that not necessarily my personal views, but some of the skeptical voices in China say, look, Russia and the DPRK would be the most cheerful and happy sides to watch the deterioration in the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing, because Russia is very happy to see views in the United States being diverted from Russiagate scandals to the alleged Chinese meddling with their electoral process.
Partially agree with your view. At least Russia will be happy to see the deterioration of China-U.S. tie rather than to see the better and better ties between China and the U.S. simply because of the deterioration of Russia-U.S. ties, right? So Russia will be happy to see the bad shape of U.S.-China relation. But for North Korea, it depends. It's a complicated answer. Say, on one hand, North Korea hate to see the bad shape of U.S.-China because the two big potatoes confrontation will produce spillover effects to the related parties, including North Korea. But on the other hand, the bad shape of the U.S.-China ties really provide extra room for North Korea to manipulate the situation. So it's the North Korean situation is quite different from Russia's situation. But basically, regardless how the other countries think or hope, China will steadily insist on our own position and the strategy. Say, we need to avoid falling the secessionist trap. That is the red line for China. No matter how bad presentation Pence made or even President Trump made, China will try every effort to avoid to go strategic confrontation with U.S. Of course, if U.S. is determined to confront against China, and China will certainly go accompany with U.S. Role to go through the confrontation. But we will pay every effort before we really slide into confrontation. So, returning to Russia and North Korea, They hope we should like be this, we should be that. That's not China's policy. Our policy is seek for a positive, cooperative, stable U.S.-China relation. That is our general goal, including the cooperation on the North Korean nuclear issue. For example, many people speculated, oh, now U.S.-China now fall in the confrontation, so China will make use of North Korea issue as a bargaining chip with the U.S. I think that's not true. For example, during the past 2 decades, China-U.S. ties has experienced a bumpy road. We have a good time.
Roller coaster.
Yeah, we have a bad time. We also have a good time. Even worse time than now. You hosted the bombing embassy.
Bombing Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, as well as surveillance plan in Hainan.
Yeah, so many bad incidents, much worse than now. And even during that period, China never changed our cooperation position with U.S. on the denuclearization.
But I'm afraid the Chinese voices will differ on what you said, the moments of crisis concerning bombing of embassy as well as the surveillance plane in Hainan, because in those years, Washington was basically quite friendly about having an engagement policy with China. But today, there's the bipartisan consensus that China is the most threatening, most scary strategic threat. Henry, your CCG think tank underwent a 4-day visit to the United States. You have chosen approximately 17 to 18 think tanks in the United States for strategic consultation on the bilateral relationship. What can you tell us about the outcomes?
Yeah, I think we had a very good, very productive visit and exchanges, including Hudson, and Richard was there, of course. But we felt, as we can feel, the consensus of China, negative on China is increasing. That's already you can easily see that. But still, throughout the exchanges with scholars, with think tanks, with business community, they still felt the two countries have such a big vital interest that really cannot separate each other. So I think that a lot of people are not happy. They want to some corrections, they want some adjustment. But I don't think that fundamentally that we are starting a Cold War is really the consensus of both sides. I think there's still a lot of communication, a lot of trust building, a lot of explanation to do. So that's why I think it's so important that we keep the dialogue, we keep the communication, and we keep the visiting of those. And I think that also that the trade issues is not something cannot be solved. There's a lot of the tariff is just one mechanism. So there's many ways that we can do that. I think it's most important that we still continue to start a dialogue so that we can also explain better. So I think that's very precisely we are doing during our trip, is to explain how what are the possible outcomes. I think that we made the 50 minutes presentation on Hudson on our think tank position is actually has some good effects. For example, a lot of people say, oh, you have intellectual property protection courts. We never heard about that. And you have and this and that. So there's quite a bit of still groundwork to do to really I think dampen the suspicions and and let's turn this a little bit around. I mean, that's really the purpose of our visit.
No easy job to get the job done, but thank you so much, gentlemen, for being part of this dialogue, which certainly will continue to lay groundwork for building trust, which is the chronic issue between our two countries. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.